Hi, and welcome to Global Governance Futures, based out of the Global Governance Institute at University College London. This is a podcast about the challenges facing humanity and possible global responses. If you're new to the show and you want to get a list of our favourite books, other resources, listen to past shows, and to join our community, go to ucl.ac.uk/global-governance. This week, it's really our pleasure to welcome onto the podcast Jim Rutt. Jim is the host of the Jim Rutt Show podcast series, which is an incredible resource for cutting-edge thinking from science to tech, culture to history, ecology, and even indigenous wisdom. The former chairman of the renowned Santa Fe Institute, and before that a key player in several tech companies, Jim brings a deep understanding of complexity science, systems thinking, human cognition, and a range of other insights to real-world problems. He's probably best known in the podosphere for his leading role in the Game B community, which we're going to get into today. Launched in 2013, Jim and other Game B luminaries who have featured in early episodes, including Jordan Hall, Daniel Schmachtenberger, and Forrest Landry, have focused their attention on realizing a new operating system for society, based upon the conviction that the current system is unsustainable and probably self-terminating. Jim's published a number of articles on Game B and related themes, which we'll include in the show notes. But this is emphatically not an academic exercise for Jim. In his own words, it is not an excuse for bloviating, but very much a call to action with a lively and growing presence across social media platforms and a number of prototype Game B initiatives underway, or what he calls Proto-Bs. Jim's also known for his straight-talking approach and iconoclastic style, especially when it comes to what he calls naive Newtonianism, as well as Game A neoliberalism, which he argues is a game which is out of control and driving us over a cliff. So it's really great to have you with us here, Jim, today.
Great to be here. You've obviously done some work and dug in, so I'm happy to take it further.
Great. Okay, well, before we dive in, I'll just invite the pod crew to say hello.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sam. I do the audio and video editing, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Jim today.
Hi, I'm Zoe. I help with the logistics for the podcast, and I'm super interested to hear where the conversation is going to go today.
All right, let's get into it. So I guess first, what is Game B and what is it not?
What is not? All right. Well, the key thing is that Game B is not Game A. It's the alternative, we think. So then you say, well, what is Game A? So in our view, Game A is the status quo social, political, economic operating system of at least the West, and to a substantial degree, currently, the world. So what we are immodestly proposing is a new socioeconomic political operating system for the world, or at least for the West. In my own framing, and by the way, Game B is famously unconsolidated. The various thinkers feel free to think their own thoughts. The community is thousands of people. None of them believe the exact same set of things. So always keep in mind that when you hear someone talk about Game B, it's a lens into a kind of a broth of ideas. But at least my take on it, and where I'm focusing these days in my thinking and analysis and my writing, is that it's kind of helpful to think of the current form of Game B, Game A, that is, starting around 1700 in the UK and to some degree in the Netherlands. And I think of three things that are the basis, and then quickly a fourth. And those three things were the invention of modern science, which I would say was fully realized with the work of Newton and Boyle and some of the other folks in the 17th century. The Glorious Revolution in the UK, 1688, where for the first time in a major country, at least, there was a principled challenge to the divine right of kings, and finally something like the beginnings of democracy were put in place. And then one I focus on a fair amount is the frozen accident of the founding of the Bank of England in 1694. Which for very peculiar reasons, the king needed a loan. And some guys said, well, we'll give you a loan if you give us the right to set up a bank. Essentially is the root of our current financial system is that founding. And those three things, I believe, are what has powered the human race to this unbelievable great transition that it's made in 1700. If you go back and look at the data, what the world's population was, the standard of living, the energy consumption, we were amazingly poor in 1700, not much more affluent than we were in 1000 BC, truthfully, a little bit. There'd been very slow growth. There've been some fallbacks in Europe, particularly during the Dark Ages. By 1700, there'd been a few hundred years of slow growth since after the Black Death, but it's still been on this long, slow thing, and people could live and die in a world that was quite similar. Starting around 1700, there was the beginnings of a takeoff, and so the fourth piece that had also been slowly accumulating in the late medieval period was technology. But in the 18th century, technology really started to roll with the well-known development of the textile industry in the north of England. Coal, which had already been started to be used in the 17th century for heating, became much more extensive, and England and Wales actually passed 50% of their energy consumption came from coal during the 18th century. We had the steam engine, and then the steam engine became truly practical with Watt's extensions to it. And so late in the 18th century and then rapidly into the early 19th century, the world started getting much more powerful. Humanity relative to nature really started to flex its muscles, particularly in energy. Prior to be able to transfer the thermal energy of coal to work through the steam engine, the limits of human power in the world had basically been human muscle, animal muscle, and wind, and to a lesser degree, water. And it was tiny on the scale of the Earth, and the amount of damage we could do to the Earth was relatively limited. At the same time, the amount of wealth we could create and the standard of living we could create was also pretty limited. But from that point forward, you take this very interesting combination of free market finance, science and technology, and call it rising individualism. Is manifested through democracy, but also other things, turned out to be the perfect set of ingredients for humanity to truly take off. And it did. And, there are some people in the Game B movement who go, oh, bad, Game A. I say no. Game A was was actually a good thing for humanity. It blasted us out of 10,000 years of empire and near starvation since the invention of agriculture, and took us to where we are today, where we have the power of gods, if not the wisdom. Now, here's the problem. You go, well, this all sounds good, right? We are, orders of magnitude, probably 2 orders of magnitude more energy intensive in our lives. We have air conditioning, we have computers, we got little phones more powerful than the computer on the Apollo mission, et cetera. We can have blueberries in February in the Northern Hemisphere. How'd that happen, right? All through the magic of Game A. But the problem with Game A is this exponential takeoff machine with no brakes. It has no brakes. Everything about it is fundamentally designed to go as fast as it can and faster and faster and faster, driven by the inner logic of money on money return. If you look at all the manifestations of things that actually drive the growth, it's that everyone's looking to make more money. And the best way to make more money is to grow exponentially, right? And oh, by the way, our financial system, because it uses debt money and fractional reserve banking, essentially it's caught on a treadmill that if the economy doesn't grow exponentially, the whole damn house of cards collapse. The whole thing is based on positive feedback loops that just keep driving the the accelerator faster and faster. As again, 1700, man was small, Earth was large. It was a good thing to enter this exponential growth curve for 3 centuries, but probably around 1960, 1970, we should have realized, and a few people did. The most famous ones, probably Rachel Carlson with her book Silent Spring, and some of the other very early environmentalists were starting to smell that something wasn't right here. Trees can't grow to the sky, and humanity is on the verge of growing to the sky. And yet, Game A had no way to transition, still has no way to really transition to a way of life that's congruent with the limits of Earth. So I think that is sort of the fundamental imperative. And then since we have gone down this road and thought about it, we realized a bunch of other things is that while we are materially rich, are we rich in spirit and in culture and in society? When you look at particularly young folks, millennials, especially those who are parents with young children, the game is just stacked against them. Housing costs are crazy. At least in the U.S., schools are very, very highly. And if you're not buying your house in a very, very expensive, or renting in a very expensive neighborhood, schools probably suck. Your kids' chances of being sucked into, mental health issues around social media, cyberbullying, stories I'm reading of, particularly young women having to groom their presentation on Instagram, and that is their life. And I go, what the fuck is that, right? Hope I'm allowed to say fuck, by the way. Is that okay?
Everything goes.
All right, yeah. So, I suppose I could operate without it, but it'd be difficult, right? Is the culture we're building actually a good one for humans? And it's our view. The answer is not really, right? And again, it's because it's not built to be good for humans. It's built to maximize money on money return. So that, in a nutshell, is what Game B is at the highest level of abstraction.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jim. We're definitely going to get more into the weeds on various strands that you sort of laid out there. I would be curious to ask, I think it's really important to put Game B in historical context, which you've done really neatly, and how that historical evolutionary process has produced these kinds of unprecedented system dynamics at a global scale that we now observe. I was wondering, is the name choice of Game A, Game B a reference to sort of the very materialist economistic game theory and the kind of default failure modes that we might associate with game theory around game theoretic constraints that animate a lot of the strategic interaction within our economy and indeed perhaps in our social world more broadly?
Now, I will say we didn't choose the name for that, but at the time the name was chosen, which was sort of accidental, we were deep in discussions about the game theoretic traps in which Game A is caught in. Right. The famous one, the real easy one to understand, is the race to the bottom, where you imagine a series of, let's say, an industry of people making some form of packaged food, let's say, and they're building nice, good, healthy food and competing, and their market share varies from year to year on who does a better job and this and that. But then one of the companies decides to make a bad move, which is to, which some of them actually did, which is to massively increase the amount of sugar in their food products, and particularly to use high fructose corn syrup, which is less expensive than all other sweeteners. Well, guess what? That makes their processed food more attractive to the consumer and less expensive to make. And so we are now in a race to the bottom trap where, let's say, the other 3 major players in the industry, if they don't respond, they're going to lose market share, lose money, stock price goes down, CEO gets fired, and all kinds of dire things happen. And so what happens is those companies, because everything is denominated in money on money return, are essentially forced, even if they don't want to, into a race to the bottom to follow this bad actor. I think you can say the same things happen in popular culture, and every category you can think of. All it takes is one person to find a profitable but antisocial niche, and everybody else in the niche is more or less forced to follow them or lose the game A of money. So in that sense, we were very well aware of this. And we talked about this a lot. So it's probably not entirely an accident that we came up with game B, because building systems that avoid game theoretical traps has got to be near the center of the design of game B.
Jim, I was wondering, you said that game A was a kind of necessary step in our development, but there might be some groups that haven't finished game A yet. And what's the argument for moving over to game B? And a kind of follow-up to that would be, can you ever finish game A, or is it, you choose to, you're sick of it and you move over?
That's a great question. I just finished reading this weekend Vaclav Smil's most recent book about how the modern world evolved, and he makes a very good point that across the world, people are at all different levels of development. There are people, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, who are still living not much different, not much better than Europeans were in 1700. And any transition on a global basis really does need to allow those people to catch up. And this has been, a game B thesis all along, that what we really are thinking about in terms of a target is a way of life for everybody on Earth that's approximately similar in terms of its burden on the Earth as essentially the intermediate destination, call it by the end of this century, where the people who are well below that point have an opportunity to rise, and those of us who are already well over that point need to find a way to build down so that we can actually have a carrying capacity of an Earth with something between 8 and 10 billion people that is sustainable within the various ecosystem services that we have, and congruent with the technology that we have. And I will say that one of the things you've asked in some of the notes you sent me was, what is game B not? It's not about hippies and mud huts, right? It's about having a good, rich, forward developing civilization that combines the limits of ecosystem services, i.e. what can Earth provide and tolerate, what is good for humans as humans, and technology, right? If someday we do find a magic energy technology, maybe fusion finally works, or someone figures out 0 point energy, or we find some way to cost effectively beam microwave energy down from orbiting solar cells, maybe we can ratchet it up our energy intensity again. But for now, the West needs to ratchet down and the rest of the world needs to come up. Smil's guesstimate was U.S. needs to cut its energy intensity of its way of life by about 2/3, something like that. Europe by maybe 40 or 50%. And in places like China are probably also already over the line, but not by much. Places like India are below the line, need to rise, et cetera. But of course, all that needs to be done in a decarbonized fashion. So game B is definitely not about, all right, we got ours. It's time to shut the door and go build ourselves a nice little eco village someplace and fuck everybody else. We very much realize that we have to take a global perspective, and it's going to mean building down in the West while building up elsewhere.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Jim, and something we've definitely been discussing here on the podcast. And I'm curious to ask, to what extent was the climate ecological crisis part of the initial impetus behind Game B? We've heard from other guests that essentially we would need to have average CO2 emissions per person globally at around 2 tons. And obviously that's a big ask for a lot of global north emitters. The average CO2 emission per person per capita in the US is around 7 tons, but among the 1%, it's more like 70 tons.
So that's why I say it's about 2/3. It's about a 2/3 reduction that we need. So 7 to 2 approximately. I usually tend to do it in gigajoules. From 300 gigajoules to about 90 gigajoules is probably about what the U.S. has to do. Europe about 150 gigajoules to 90, something like that. And well, of course, a lot of that also, of course, depends on the technology. Right? We have magic energy, right? You can have as much energy as you want, but within the capital cost capability to build the non-carbon energy by the end of the century, those numbers seem reasonable. I will say at the very beginning, 2012, 2013, climate per se was something we knew about and was part of our basket, but we were focused, and I would say we still are, on the broader basket of ecosystem services. In addition, things like topsoil, water usage, et cetera. Though I would say that if we were relaunching Game B today, or if it was fresh, we would probably, as we are, emphasizing climate more, as it's the hammer that will get us if the other ones don't, essentially. I will say, in my original write-up in 2012, I actually wrote about pandemics as one of the things that might get us. And turned out it didn't get us this time, but it gave us a nice little warning shot across the bow, saying, "Hey guys, imagine if this thing were as deadly as Mars or something like that, and as contagious as the Delta variant of COVID. We'd have a serious case of hurt on our hands." So, but hopefully we'll learn something from it. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But from the beginning, the limits of Earth's carrying capacity has been central. But I would say since then, as it's become more salient elsewhere, and as we've all done more reading and research, climate's out there as kind of the end of the 21st century hammer. If we don't have that one fixed by then, it's going to get us.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of climate scientists are looking at the extreme weather events in the US and Canada, and also having to sort of update their models and to think about, well, what might be the timeframes here. And I guess there's some sober consideration there in terms of what the timeframes might be for shifting, as Sam put it, from a pre-B space to a proto-B to a game B. We might need to bring some of those timeframes forward somehow.
Or maybe we can't, though. We have to live in reality. And for instance, one of the U.S. presidential candidates who I had actually supported in 2016, Bernie Sanders, in his 2020 platform, it was just ridiculous. He said, we're going to have 100% renewable energy, 100% in the transportation and the energy generation sector by 2030. And I said, Bernie, you're an idiot, a clown. It couldn't be done. I went and talked to some of the experts that I knew of, and I know some of the top experts. And my first thing was, well, maybe Stalin could have done it. And they said, no, Stalin couldn't have done it. The only one that might have been able to do it was Pol Pot. If you're prepared to kill, half the population and reduce your economy by 80% in 5 years, maybe you could do it. But and so part of the way forward is going to be mitigation as well. We're not going to get under 1.5 degrees C since the historical baseline. My own little noodling and simple models say 2.25. And there's going to be all kinds of shit that happens. On the other hand, humans are very adaptable, and people will die, and there will be wars, and bad stuff will happen, but probably not enough to crush civilization. But if we don't deal with it and we get plus 6 degrees, plus 5, then that will crush civilization. So we have to, yes, it would be nice if we could do it in 12 years, but let me tell you, we can't, not even close. If we can get to effectively carbon zero by 2060, that'd be nice. We can survive that.
Yeah, I've been doing quite a lot of climate governance research recently, and it's been a steep learning curve on the climate science, getting my head around the exponential function, for example, and getting my head around also of the CO2 lag effect, the fact that the CO2 heating effect takes around 2 decades to actually come to actually have that impact, because the ocean initially absorbs the heat, and so there's these feedback effects that, frankly, I wonder whether a lot of people are aware of exactly how the climate system, which is an incredibly complex system, operates, and it would be good perhaps to raise the awareness around some of those factors which defy human cognition, if you will. But speaking of experts, Jim, I did want to cue Zoe in. Zoe's got a great question for you.
I'd like to clarify, I'm not an expert in anything. Speaking of learning, I guess there's lots of willful ignorance, I think, is what we kind of were just talking about. Thinking about how academia and Game B potentially interact, what do you think the role of universities might be in equipping young people with the tools to sort of face the challenges and the complexity that would come from needing to move from Game A to Game B, for example? And how do you think universities are really doing? I mean,
well, they're doing nothing at the present time, hardly. The whole university system is busted in a major way, and it's so captured by its own internal politics and so many constituencies. I don't know how we're going to fix the universities. Game B is assuming you're just going to have to build a complete parallel education system from scratch and seduce the people over time. But it would be nice if the educational system could start really building in from the beginning a complexity lens on reality, right? Of all the things that are helpful to get people to actually understand all these things we've talked about, game theoretic race to the bottom and other traps, exponential growth, the nature of fat tail distributions and social phenomena, the inability to really model the future very well. You can actually manage model weather vastly better than you can manage culture, the model culture, right? Because culture has strategic agents in it. And once you throw strategic agents into a simulation, the trajectories that are possible go all over the place. You think we have problems managing weather models, which we do. They're still not very complete with respect to clouds. They're not very full with respect to some of the good news around climate, which is that increased CO2 and increased temperature produce more water in the water cycle, and CO2 produces plant growth. So we actually should see a negative feedback loop on more carbon being sequestered in the soil and in trees, and et cetera. But a complexity lens would help. And one of the things that I keep pushing is that a complexity lens, particularly with respect to social systems, means one needs to have epistemic modesty. The ability to know the future very far out is just not there. I would say that the three things to teach kids are thinking in exponentials, which humans don't do naturally, understanding the idea of fat tails, which is that complex systems, large events happen much more often than Gaussian statistics would indicate. And the third is epistemic modesty, in that when you make changes in a complex system, the results are often unanticipated and unanticipatable. And so the only really reasonable way to move forward is in tight loops of theory, experiment, with relatively small steps along the way. Great.
That's a lot to chew on. I guess a little follow-up would be also in terms of systems thinking in education. Maybe would we benefit from also incorporating just caring about other humans in education and in these complexity lenses? Because, I mean, did we ever really incorporate that in education, that we should care what happens to other people? Because it feels like that is definitely something that might be lacking from all just generalized mainstream education.
And of course, there's a good reason, probably, in that we evolved in hunter-gatherer bands, forager bands of 50 to 150 people. In fact, I'm having Robin Dunbar on my podcast next month, which will be fun. We'll talk about the Dunbar number, and so we were not evolved to worry about 10 billion people, right? In fact, it's a relatively recent phenomenon, since maybe 1625 that we've been even tended to strongly identify ourselves with a nation state. More often, it was a smaller ethnic group of people who spoke a common language and had some common traditions. You know, France had 11 languages in 1000 AD, right? And it was at least 11 ethnicities in France since 1625, and the era of absolute kings and such. Now they got one language basically and one country. So, then making the next loop, the next step to consider humanity as a whole is really a hard step. And whether that's the job for education or whether that's the job for morality, for values and virtue is, I think, an interesting question. We believe that those things must be cooked into Game B as our virtues, our values, and our norms. I think our ethical system is kind of a hybrid between Aristotelian virtue ethics and utilitarian ethics, essentially at the same time. And then, with some additions of opening the scope so that we have to include everybody. Nobody gets left behind. We can't be a lifeboat philosophy, which unfortunately, some people who are in this, who understand the problem say, all right, it's just impossible. We'll all move to New Zealand, all of us billionaires, and we'll fortify the place, and that'll be that. We certainly don't believe that in the Game B world. But I'm not sure that it's not obvious to me that ethics is something that universities ought to be teaching. That ought to be done in the community.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We had Forrest Landry on the show a few months ago, and we discussed with him how ethics is integral to a complexity understanding of our reality, that there is no view from nowhere, that we are all embedded in this kind of ecological interdependency, and we need to sort of really absorb that insight and understand the implications. And I know that you've said that the great value of complexity science is that it's about how things work and what makes things real. And we hear a lot about complexity in the Game B space. We hear a lot of concepts from complexity science, such as the adjacent possible, basins of attraction, attractors. How do these conceptual tools apply to the task of building a social operating system to replace Game A, and perhaps also keeping in mind those who are new to complexity science, or indeed those who are resistant? I can remember a colleague recently saying in a paper, that complexity is a, quote, festival of bad metaphors. How do we overcome that kind of resistance? What is the gateway to thinking in complexity terms?
For me, it was doing agent-based modeling and simulations, right? Which is very, very interesting. You build an agent-based model, and so-called emergence happens, which is that things that you don't expect to happen. Things that are sort of fundamentally unpredictable from lower-level phenomena. And of course, the classic example of emergence is life, right? You start with the laws of physics, and you have atoms and you have molecules from chemistry. It was quite a stretch to go from chemistry to organic chemistry, right? Very simple life like bacteria and archaea. And then it was another giant leap to go to the eukaryotic cells, which were a huge leap, where we started having mitochondria and then chloroplasts, et cetera, that made the cells much more energetic and capable of doing much more. And another leap to multicellularity, and then an explosion, the Cambrian explosion. So these are classic examples of emergence. And you can see some of this in more limited ways in simulations. So I suppose simulations on one side and evolution on the other. The evolutionary lens is something that everybody at the Santa Fe Institute uses to a greater or lesser degree. Everything came from something simpler in the past, it's fair to say. I've done some very interesting podcasts recently on the evolution of technology. We had Brian Arthur on. Actually, we're actually going to publish it on Wednesday on his book on the nature of technology. We had Matt Ridley on recently on his book about innovation, et cetera. And one of the points they both make is that everything comes from something simpler. And over time, as they become more complex, we get emergent phenomena. And so we use this a lot when we think about what interventions do we actually ought to do to bring game B into being, right? And we contrast complexity with complicatedness. Something like the U.S. Army, it's complicated. It's a rigid structure, top down, orders follow, from a big American corporation like General Motors or something, same way. Our sense, the art and science of building game B enterprises and organizations is through self-organization, using network communications, using ideas around signaling and membranes, et cetera, that are more fluid than these complicated structures, which we keep building and making them more and more complicated to deal with the side effects of what's inherently a complex world.
Jim, we were talking before the podcast about your kind of role within social media and Facebook and Twitter, and say for example we succeed and we survive, and we're looking back 300 years at the early beginnings of game B, a bit like we might learn about enlightenment now, and the kind of the material conditions, the societal conditions that brought about the thinking of enlightenment. What would you say the role of tech is in the kind of conditions that bring about game B thinking? Is there a link between tech and its abundance and the global phenomena that it is, and game B and how that might be able to manifest?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And actually, if they put it into the emergence of the modern or the Enlightenment, in the same way that science, democracy, and fractional reserve banking were some of the prerequisites for game A. Tech is a prerequisite for game B in several ways, right? One is tech, and also, by the way, highly efficient manufacturing is also a prerequisite for game B, in that both of them enable non-rivalrous economics, which is that. So for the audience, one of the things we talk about from the very beginning of game B is the distinction between rivalrous economics and non-rivalrous economics. An example of rivalrous economics is a ham sandwich. Either you eat it or I eat it, right? We can't both eat it. So it's a rivalry of who gets to eat the ham sandwich. Well, a perfect example of a non-rivalrous good is an MP3 file of somebody's favorite music. The incremental cost these days, because of tech, to copy that is almost zero. So if we really want to maximize human utility, everyone who wants that MP3 ought to be able to have it. We ought not have gateways like intellectual property and all that sort of stuff. And of course, that then leads to a big question about how do you compensate creators to give them incentives to create, et cetera? How do you have a culture of creation where people aren't paid royalties, for instance? And we've done quite a bit of work on that. And so tech enables non-rivalrous economics. And should we make some additional big moves in tech, say around self-assembling nanotechnology, the number of goods that will become closer to being non-rivalrous versus rivalrous will increase. Secondly, we talked about fractional reserve banking and this inner loop of money on money return that is driving game A over the cliff. We need technology to have other signaling modalities to coordinate cooperation. And truthfully, I can't tell you what those are yet. This is work still in progress. Obviously, we look at some of the crypto projects, though most of those are game A on steroids, tell you the truth. There are some projects that are more interesting, like HoloCoin is an interesting project. A few others. I personally don't believe that the classic Bitcoin tree of crypto is probably what we're looking for, but some form of social signaling to coordinate all the things that we use money for today is going to be necessary, and those would not really be very feasible without our networked world. So yes, I do believe when that graduate student is working on his thesis on where the hell did game B come from, one of the things they'll enumerate as the takeoff prerequisites was a high-tech world. Game B would have made no sense in 1700. Just as a game A would have made no sense in 5000 BC.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And just to follow on that graduate student in a couple of 100 years writing their thesis on the origins of Game B, say if we red team for a moment Game B, and what are some of the, I don't know if you've modeled on this, but the kind of potential pitfalls of Game B as it potentially expands, as often we've seen in the history tells us that good ideas, once they expand, can often kind of mutate into quite horrible ideas.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. And because we do have an evolutionary lens, we know that possibility exists, and we can't give a definitive answer. However, we do have some, shall we say, prophylactics. One of the ones that we talk about a fair amount is that Game A, because of its nature of command and control and power, and the fact that it no longer has any filtering mechanisms, attracts sociopaths at a high rate. I was a public company CEO and a C-level executive and a multi-billion-dollar multinational, and did work on Wall Street and worked in the U.S. White House when I was very young. And my own estimate is at least 10% of C-level executives in major American corporations are sociopaths. In finance, it's probably 30%. And if we then talk about the game theoretical race to the bottom trap, even 10% sociopaths is probably enough to tip the whole system into a sociopathic game. And so one of the things we focus a lot on in thinking about our Game B institutions is how do we make damn sure that we keep sociopaths away from the levers of power? And how exactly we do that, I don't know, but it's certainly one of the design features that we're going to have. And I think it was Daniel actually pointed out that sociopaths may actually be useful. It's maybe useful to have 1% sociopaths for war fighting and things of that sort. But you absolutely do not want them anywhere near the institutional levers of power. And late stage Game A, at least since 1970 or thereabouts, has opened the floodgates to sociopaths having access to the levers of power. So that would be one thing. The other one, this goes back to the very early pre-Game B thinking even, is radical transparency. Say Wall Street, the main profit engine in Wall Street is opacity, as it turns out. Let's make the products as confusing as possible so no one can possibly understand them except us, and we will, trick various fools. We'll make lots of money. Our ideas around, a next generation finance are radical transparency, and Bitcoin-style crypto would have had that opportunity, except for they made the wrong move of moving towards anonymity, or at least pseudo-anonymity. If you had the high trackability of blockchain, but with well-fashioned, stable identity, and also one of my own favorite reforms, which is to have a limit that no stack of abstract entities could be more than 5 levels deep, so that any entity, a trust, a limited liability corporation, a partnership, a corporation, or the Game B equivalent, must within 5 links end up on a human, and the track must be transparent. We believe will help a lot. Of course, there's a whole bunch of institutional reforms around governance that need to be done. Late stage Game A is frankly probably always Game A, but particularly since in 1975, money has captured politics pretty much across the world. Money or something very similar to money. And so we have to make sure that doesn't happen. And again, tech platforms give us some opportunities to do that. One of the ideas I put forth in the very earliest days of Game B, was that to the degree that we have elections, which I think we're becoming less and less interested in elections actually as a means of governance, but to the degree we do have elections, imagine we still had them, we could do campaign finance using modern money-like entity, and have special money that's political speech money, so that every person got the equivalent of $100 or pounds or euros a year, and only that money could be used for electioneering or issue advocacy, and that there were then special entities set up who were able to transform, let's call it blue money or political money, into regular money. And that transformation would be a matter of public record and radically transparent. And I think if you did things like that, you'd have a fairly good chance of avoiding some of the capture modes that we have seen in Game A. But I will tell you, because it was a very good question, and we know that it is possible Game B could lead to a worse nightmare than Game A, right? The Marxist-Leninists, probably some of them at least, thought they were doing sincerely good work for the world. Wrong, guys, and maybe we are too. But at least we're aware of it, and I think we understand the dynamics. We understand tendency towards game theoretic traps. We understand capture, and we understand, at least to some degree, the dangers of sociopaths. And so we have to build in. Brett Weinstein, an evolutionary scientist, very smart guy, has been involved in Game B from the very beginning, continues to always stress this, that we have to build an immune system into Game B to minimize the chances of it going off in a bad direction. Can't guarantee it, though.
Yeah, so I'd like to pick up on that, Jim. So in a way, what we're talking about is, well, what is the design space that Game B would operate in? What would it look like? How do we design a space which protects Game B integrity? And you set out a range of sort of general principles that should guide Proto-Bs, including that they be non-hierarchical, that they be network-centric, that they be long-term meta-stable. And you brought up the example just then of the military as an example of a complicated hierarchical structure. And I guess Game B is kind of counterposed to that kind of arrangement. But I'd like to push a bit more. I mean, is Game B itself, is it a prototype organization or plan for different scales of organization up to the civilisational level? Or is it meant to be sort of non-tangible? Is it not meant to prescribe that kind of detailed orientation? Is it not meant to prescribe forms of organizational hierarchy? Is that lack of prescription intentional, or could that actually be a problem down the road?
I would say we don't know enough yet, but we do believe that at the biggest picture, Game B will have to have communications and signaling modalities up the whole stack, but that we should think of the stack as, rather than being a rigid set of hierarchies, should be essentially fractally designed, and where it will have different depths in different areas. But we also think that if we do Game B right, the Game B principles ought to more or less apply at every level. So, for instance, something that's sort of vaguely analogous to a nation state, we would argue is probably a bit smaller than our current big nation states, but maybe we're wrong, would still have to operate under radical transparency, for instance, and have anti-sociopath filters and, generally approximate equality of economic outcomes for people. Maybe not exact, maybe a factor of 10, but certainly not the current factor of 1 million. So we think whatever set of principles we finally perfect at the Proto-B level will also apply to the higher levels as well, which of course makes the design question considerably more tricky.
I also wanted to pick up on, you made that distinction between complicated and complex, and I would certainly refer our audience to your excellent podcast with Dave Snowden on that distinction. And I was curious to ask, how does that distinction relate to this transition? We have a prototype Game B emerging from within a legacy Game A sort of structural context. So one imagines that in some respects, Game B is expected to be parasitic on Game A. And I think you said elsewhere, it's explicitly parasitic. Yeah, okay. So, and you've said elsewhere that the Achilles heel of Game A is that it does not understand complexity. So given that Game A does seem to hold all of the cards, it does seem to be incredibly powerful in the current zeitgeist, does that give us reason to be optimistic, and why?
Well, I would say it's optimistic, but with a question mark. You asked, what are some more failure modes? One that we've identified as an outstanding piece of work, which absolutely needs to be done, and if we don't succeed, we will probably fail, is to design a series of operating systems for entities. Let's think of them as like businesses. We call them Game B ventures, and they might use some existing test Game B-ish operating systems, or things like Sociocracy or Holacracy. There's some others. Forrest Landry's actually got an early bit of work on one where we think create ways that collaborative and cooperative enterprises that do actual work in the world could be more efficacious and could outcompete their Game A alternatives using a new internal operating system that operates at the level of what you could think of as an enterprise. And if we cannot do that, the prospects of Game B successfully parasitizing Game A go down substantially. There are some other routes to get there, but that's a key right there. Can we, as we say in some of the Game B literature, can we actively outcompete Game A in at least some important economic categories using Game B approaches? And if we can, that is the takeoff mechanism to cause Game B to grow quite rapidly by actively and explicitly parasitizing Game A. And at the same time, we have another little trick that we have, which is, as we talked about earlier, it's really important for long-term metastability of a Game B global civilization that we substantially cut our consumption of stuff and energy. And one of the interesting side effects about that is that it means that our cost of living in Game A terms will be very much reduced, which means, and if we can be as productive or more productive in Game A terms, that means our savings rates will be crazy. We might have internal savings rates on the order of 50%. And if you run the numbers on, if you then reinvest that savings rate in building more Game B, the takeoff is pretty amazing over time. And so I think that's another little noted part of our competitive dynamic. If it actually costs, let's say, half is what it to have a good quality of life in Game B as it does in Game A, and yet your economic earning capacity through a Game B venture is more or less equal or even better to what it is in Game A. That generates a staggering cash flow to build Game B from.
Now, I'd like to flag that in some of your writings, you've laid out very practical, pragmatic sort of stepping stones to what a Proto-B, prototype Game B community might look like, what it might invest its time in doing, how it might actually cultivate a different way of being in the world, but not necessarily separate to the world. And I think that's incredibly helpful. And I say that because often one finds perhaps in these conversations that there's a bit of a polarization between, say, the tech utopians who sort of take the Steven Pinker line and those who are more, into the catastrophe, a bit more of a sort of doomer kind of perspective, who would say or respond, well, that all sounds great, but it's really not realistic. I mean, there's sort of this default into despair sometimes. And I would just note that you're not someone who's afraid to get their hands dirty in the cut and thrust of business and indeed politics. One of the early initiatives that you were leading on was launching a political party, the Emancipation Party, focused on severing this link between politics and money. But I'm wondering, given that you have kind of, it seems, shelved that particular part of the Game B manifesto for the time being, where would you apply, or where would you suggest people apply their energy who want to start really pushing, making some concerted effort in this direction in a very practical fashion?
In the short term, well, as we laid out in my paper, A Journey to Game B, I suggest that people start in a pre-B mindset, which is, start getting yourself ready to participate in some of the next phases we'll talk about briefly. Keep your expenditures under control. Don't be captured by advertising, right? If you got a fancy car, get rid of it, right? If you got a really, do not aspire to a gigantic house in a fancy suburb, right? It's a trap, people. Don't feel that you need to, have a diamond ring for engagement. What the fuck's that all about, right? Get rid of all that shit. Get it out of your head. Learn some real useful skills. Learn how to do some carpentry, electrician, plumbing, farming. Get yourself in some reasonable physical shape. Of course, I say that, and I'm not necessarily the best example on that one, but oh well. We does our best. Et cetera. And so try to deprogram oneself. You pay off all the debts that you have. Do not incur any debts, right? Debt is poison. You don't want your debts following you into game B. And just get yourself ready. And then to get ready for what? The things that we can do right now are Proto-Bs, which are on the ground residential communities of people who want to live in a more game B way that emphasizes community and conviviality and good human living. Particularly, I'm interested in, some other people are too, communities that are really great for raising children. If you're, 25 to 35 with a couple of kids, middle class or even upper working class jobs, wouldn't it be great to be able to live really well at that time of your life with lots of people to help you with childcare, with good education, with healthy food grown right on the property, et cetera. So two Proto-Bs have already bought their land. There's at least two more that will probably do so soon. And next year, really interesting to see how many Proto-Bs emerge. And of course, you start small, but if we can get an exponential growth going, we can eventually have many of these things. And then the other side is Game B Ventures, which can be launched by people who are not part of Game B communities, but these are, nominally at least to the outside world, for-profit businesses that would be owned by their employees and or by a Proto-B. We do think that Proto-Bs and alliances of Proto-Bs, because they'll have high savings rates, will have the ability to fund Game B ventures and have some part of the cash flows that come back from those Game B ventures to help fund their Proto-Bs, as well as provide work for people on the Proto-Bs, et cetera. So those are the two next steps. And as you say, it's very tangible, but there are things we have to work out. The governance methods, both for the Proto-B communities and for the Game B ventures. We have some ideas, we have some things off the shelf so we could try, but those things have to be perfected over the next few years. And they really do have to work. And though, again, as I said, epistemic modesty, do I think that the current ideas we have will all work? No. But I think that they're not sufficiently idiotic that you can't at least get started. And then you say, all right, well, this sort of seemed like a good idea, but it didn't quite work. So we need to adjust this, right? Whether it's a capital structure, or whether it's management structures, whether it's governance architectures. Is liquid democracy a good idea? I've done a lot of thinking about it. I think it could be, but it hasn't been tried at sufficient scale to sign off on it. So let's say a Proto-B decides to use liquid democracy and finds it sort of works, but has this problem. So we tweak it. And the other really important thing that we emphasize, and we've done a little more work on the Proto-B side than the venture side, but that's going to change next year, is that we don't want all the Proto-Bs to be using exactly the same operating system because we're not sure that we have the answers. In fact, I'm sure we don't, but that we should think of Proto-Bs as an exploration of high-dimensional design space for communities to produce a very good human quality of life, but at a much lower economic cost than the Game A equivalent in terms of quality of life, and most importantly, within the carrying capacity of our ecosystem services. And by the way, these Proto-Bs are not in isolation. They're in horizontal communications with each other. And so Proto-B in Oregon, USA, discovers some trick for how to do something, and it exchanges it across the whole Game B community. And the Proto-B in Portugal says, "Oh, that's a good idea. We'll adopt that and insert it into our local operating system." And then, the one over in Italy says, "Oh, those guys in Portugal, we know them. They tried this thing from Oregon. It's working. We're going to do it too, right?" And so we see this. This is where the technology is essential. If we had to do this by what was it called? The community of letters back in the early 18th century, wouldn't be anywhere near fast enough. But the fact that we can do it electronically in video with Zoom meetings and everything else means that horizontal communications across the various parts of the Game B world can happen at very high speed.
Yeah, I really like that. It makes me sort of think Game B is really about experimenting locally, but making it portable. I think that raises a really crucial question around scale and boundaries, which is one which preoccupies me and my colleagues a lot. I mean, circling back to Zoe's question on cultivating an ethical care, I mean, at what level should we be seeking to solve problems? Is Game B really a civilisational level design task, or on much more pragmatic grounds, should it focus at the smaller scale, perhaps under the Dunbar number? So,
that's a good question. And, we don't know for sure. We do believe that to accomplish our goals, we do have to find a way to scale to at least the civilization level, and maybe to the global level. But we do think that the emphasis has to come from a bottom-up perspective rather than a top-down, at least until we proved a lot more than we have today. If you made some Game B person the dictator of the world and said, "Build Game B right now, top-down," I imagine it would turn out to be quite a shit show. Not something I'd recommend, even if I was the guy. God damn it, right? That we need to try this stuff and grow it up. But we do think that it scales. For instance, Jordan Hall's concept of the civium, which is a network of a bunch of Proto-Bs that operate together under a collective ownership. They all own each other, essentially. It's all one legal entity, if you want to use Game A terminology, and one shared economy is one definite possibility. It's also possible that the Proto-Bs are autonomous, but they have rapid signaling and sharing. They have their own currency, perhaps their own internal trading systems, et cetera, that preferentially make it advantageous for them to trade with each other and to provide the things that the others don't. Because one of the things we learned from Adam Smith, if nobody else, is that specialization is important, right? You're not going to get tolerable economic efficiency without some level of specialization. So different Proto-Bs are going to focus on different things. So there'll be a need to have plenty of trade, even in the Game B world, even though we are going to focus on shorter range trade. We do think that the idea of intercontinental, of sending plastic toys around the world, is probably not a good idea in terms of keeping our energy burned down and preserving our ecosystem services. But on the other hand, the idea that we're going to retreat to the medieval village where everything you need is made within 3 miles of you, I think is also highly unrealistic. So we do see some self-assembly at higher and higher levels coming from the bottom up. And at some point, you'll have to be some governance, whether we'll capture current political systems or we'll just build alternatives. Is hard to say. But I expect that we'll try to solve the problem up to at least, I think I said in that Journey to Game B paper, at least to the level of 500 million people, something like that.
Well, it certainly sounds like a wild adventure.
Yeah, it keeps me busy, keeps me off the streets. It seems absurdly ambitious, but I've yet to find the fatal flaw why it couldn't be done. And as you said, I'm a very practical guy, right? I build things, right? I'm a farmer. If I thought this was just an idiot bunch of hippies with some ideas that will never work, I would have long since said hell with it. but I've yet to find the fatal flaw. In fact, in my business world, one of my favorite talks I gave is called "Shoot the Puppy," and the idea is from idea to exit in a venture, you should be prepared to shoot the puppy if it does not work. And so far, we have not shot the Game B puppy. We haven't answered all the questions, but it's like a venture has not answered all its questions in its early stages. And Game B is still very early, right? We don't even have a single fully operational Proto-B. When we have 100 Proto-Bs and a few hundred Proto-B ventures, or Game B ventures, then we may find the fatal flaw in it. On the other hand, I don't think so. It smells right to me that this idea of network centricity, decentralization, self-organization, and metastability are the big four, that if we steer by those, we can be able to build a new worldwide, or at least civilization level operating system, which we can survive in as humanity for the long term, and then go see what our human destiny is. Personally, I want us to go explore the universe, but I think we should not be spending big expenditures on that until we figured out how to live stably on our planet for tens of thousands of years.
One thing at a time. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you, Jim. I'm conscious of time. I think we're rolling to the close. I'd like to just hand over to Zoe for the final question.
So sort of looking to the future and the younger generations who maybe are a little bit more cynical about the future and who definitely feel like they've had their future prospects sort of worsened, not least by COVID and all of the accumulating challenges that it poses and that it lays bare. What would you say to those younger generations who maybe might be harder to convince and who would think that this is an idea where you would have to shoot the puppy, or that it's all, that they can't even aspire to having a planet to live on that would be livable, and who just don't see the point of even trying anything? Because I feel like that's sort of prevalent amongst younger generations, at least in conversations I've had with people my age and younger than me.
Frankly, those people won't be Game B players in the beginning, right? People who have reached the level of cynicism and despair, sorry, but we do have an answer for them, which is we'll show them, right? And let's say you're right. 90% of young folks fall. I doubt it's anywhere near that high. In fact, currently in the Game B world, millennials are without a doubt the biggest chunk, right? Millennials are the most younger Gen Xers, and now Zoomers are starting to join up. So there's plenty of them. Even if it's only 10%, that's still a whole bunch of people. We then build few thousand Proto-Bs, right? Come visit one, come live on one for a while, right? Because we're going to have, temp space, kind of the equivalent of Airbnb or workspace, work on our organic farm, et cetera. And people, I don't know why people object to this word, but I use it, I like it, is that Game B will seduce people out of Game A, right? I don't know what's wrong with seduce. Seems like a perfectly reasonable word to me, but some people object to it. Oh, well, fuck them. These cynical millennials and Zoomers, come see Game B, hang out for a couple of weeks. Would you rather go back to the rat race as it is? Or would you rather, come and live in a place where we actually are living on 90 gigajoules per person per year. And we actually are living on a sustainable diet that won't deplete the soil and won't require us to kill off the remaining wildlife on our planet. And over time, people are convinced by reality. If I was young and grew up in the shit show we have today, I'd probably be a cynical motherfucker too. Once we've actually shown that this is possible, and there's always a group that's willing to try. And frankly, as I say, the biggest group today in Game B is millennials because they feel the biggest need. Then we'll show people frankly, it's the same way the West beat the Marxist-Leninists, right? Eventually, it just became so obvious that the way of life in the West was so much better than under Marxist-Leninism. People just threw up their hands and said, hell with it. And that's at least a hopeful analogy for how we think Game B will eventually overcome that cynicism and seduce people over to Game B.
That certainly gives me a lot of hope. Thank you very much.
Well, there's an invitation that you can't refuse, I'd say. Thanks, Jim. Thanks so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. We'll obviously be watching the game B space with a lot of interest. And maybe we're already in some modest fashion undertaking some kind of Proto-B conversation here as well. I think we'd kind of like to think so. So we really appreciate your collaboration in this project.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank you guys for being so well prepared. You've clearly done your thinking, your research, and it's always a joy to talk with folks that ask good questions, not just general vague ones. And for people out there that want to get in touch, as we say, find the others, we have our own Game B community at game-b.org. It's currently not open to the general public, but we have some filtering questions, and we'll ask you where you heard about it. Say you heard about it from Jim Rutt himself, that miserable asshole, right? Or just mention this show, and our mods will let you in, and you can meet the other several thousand people in the Game B space, and perhaps find somebody near you to get together with and form a Proto-B or become part of a Game B venture. So that's game-b.org. See you there.
Yep, you'll find me there too. So yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Jim. And also do tune into the Jim Rutt Show. It's always a really, really worthwhile, fascinating listen. So yeah, thanks, Jim.
Thanks for the plug, and thanks for the good conversation.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks for tuning into Global Governance Futures. To get access to all of our content and to stay up to date with future Zoom calls, workshops and events and more, check us out at ucl.ac.uk/global-governance. And if you like this content, please do leave us a comment and subscribe. Until next time.